describe it and describe how we use it in our context. Then I'm going to try and hopefully guide people through some steps to entering a DBR cycle. And then I'm going to give some reflections on this as a framework. And it's not all positives, but it's mainly positives. But there are things to be cautious about. So I'm going to ask you to have some technology in hand. I'd like you to have a piece of paper and a pencil. So good old-fashioned technology. And I've got a couple of questions going through. Now, I'm not doing breakout rooms because I, again, find that my phone is tweeting. I find that I get things broken if I start doing lots of fancy stuff. So again, I work with technology in my research context, but it doesn't mean I'm really, really good at it. Okay, so design-based research has been around since the early 2000s. It's actually been around a lot longer than that, to the 90s. And I gave some reading before the session that sort of kind of set the scene for it, if you had time to look at it. It wasn't something I knew about before maybe 10 years ago, even more recently in terms of thinking it as a big picture approach. But what I did know is that I was working as a researcher in chemistry education, but also working as an instructor in the classroom. And I wanted to be careful that there wasn't sort of bias introduced by one over the other, that I was able to conduct research, but that I could also convert it into that classroom context. So this is a framework that I found is really useful since, and it was introduced to me by a mentor and colleague, Carmel McNaught, and I'll mention Carmel a couple of times in the presentation. So the underlying principles are shown graphically there. It's an iterative process, and it starts with many of us, as we do, looking at what our students are doing in the classroom and noticing that something isn't right, or the way that students are learning isn't what we hoped for, or that we have something we'd like to achieve and we don't know how to go about doing it. Then we might go to the literature to be informed by it, or we might talk to colleagues. And so we start on that basic contextual approach of, well, what's going on and why and how do I know? So what design-based research enables us to do is apply the theory and empirical evidence of what's good in terms of pedagogy, strategies, interventions, and as our foundation. And that's really important, and that's what makes it different to action research. It enables us to adapt or innovate and try and find ways to improve student learning based on the evidence we get from each iteration. It enables us to collect evidence, but we need to do that through strong methodological frameworks and literature frameworks. So this is not discarding anything that's done in other methodologies. And I know across the 3 sessions of MISA, we're going to see lots of presentations and workshops and ways of doing. And those are really part of what design-based research is. It's a big picture framework that you can fit other things into, like jigsaw puzzles, so the pieces come together in your own context. And it's very important that what we find out from what we're doing in translating research into practice links back to theoretical understanding, and that enables us to actually publish the outcomes of the research we do with students in a classroom context. And so I've put that representation there of design-based research that comes from McKenney and Reeves. But I actually tend to draw very strongly on the work of Wang and Hanafin, which is very well known. Both of these are highly cited works, over 1,500 citations each. I think it's 2,000 for Wang and Hanafin. So the field as such is building momentum and getting more credibility as it moves. And I actually like the words that Wang and Hanafin use in terms of the nature of DBR, and just trying to get the people's screen to move out of the way of my words there. So hang on, this is my technology skills going. Oh yeah, I made everyone at the top.
So Gwen, Gwen, I learned you can just move that or minimize those pictures if you need to.
Lovely, thanks. It's just in the way there. So it's pragmatic, it's grounded because it's informed by theory. It's interactive, which means that it's responsive. It's iterative, it's flexible, it's integrative, and it's contextual. And if you go back to the pre-readings, you can actually look into those definitions a little bit more. Okay, so why is it not moving? Okay. So if we think about what happens in terms of research, we often inform instructional design through application of theory, and we often think of it as a single instance. So there'll be an iteration, we'll collect data from students, what they do, and then we'll have data that comes out of it through evaluation, research questions, and it could be quantitative, qualitative. We might use that to analyze what happened to inform the next cycle, or we might call those research outcomes and publish them and add back into the theory. So the data from the classroom becomes something that informs theory or supports it or raises more questions. And so what I talk about is actually that we talk about research-informed practice, but we also talk about practice-informed research, and that's important. For design-based research, what we're talking about is a series of cycles of linked application of theory and adaptation and innovation over a period of time that enables us to build a base of data, but also use that to adjust what we're doing in practice to improve the learning experience for students and their learning outcomes. So it very much is this iterative, cyclical and reflective approach that I want to hope to convey to you. However, it's also complex and messy. And if you think about this over several iterations, and it can be years, and I think my example will be over years that I'm going to show you, there's so many variables involved with this, not least that there's iterations of students involved, and we start to raise questions about, you know, the validity of the outcomes and how we can build on them and so on and so forth. And that actually is what basis to some of the criticisms of design-based research as a field or a way of doing research. So the important thing is when we're looking at these cycles, what I'm not going to do today is to give you a single methodology and say this is how it's applied. I'm going to show how I've chosen several methodologies and use them, but it doesn't mean that that's all you can do. You have to find the methodology that fits the research that you're doing and the learning challenge that you're trying to solve, or what you want to know from students' learning. And one of the frameworks that I tend to draw on a lot is what we call the Leepo Framework. And that's because that in large classes, tertiary teaching, we are working in not a conventional classroom. We're working where students are in different spaces. They may be partially online. And so it's very complicated. So looking at the learning environment, what is the space that the teacher and the students are in together? Looking at the learning process, so what students are doing in response to what the teachers have built around the learning environment, and then measuring the learning outcomes, which of course is different forms of assessment. The Leepo framework enables us to ask questions and collect data to look at the different interactions between these different pieces. And so, again, I'm not going to go into in depth, and if anybody would like to know more about the application of that framework, please do contact me later, and I'm happy to have a conversation about it. But it's something that's been very important to us, and I'm going to show a couple of examples, but I want you to have in the back of your head that we're talking about the big picture of a classroom context and how the research is fitting in, and also then the practice and the outcomes of students is coming out back into inform new research questions. Another framework, so that's just one example. A second one that I've used in different studies is the Conversational Framework. But again, because it looks at the different elements of a classroom and what teachers and students are doing, and students with other students, and all those different interactions that may occur. And the Conversational Framework is much more about the doing, what's happening. So looking at students' interactions with teachers and the content, and so acquiring, inquiring, producing, looking at how they interact with peers, discussion, and so on and so forth. And so that again is another useful framework for collecting data to inform the research questions, depending on which aspect of those interactions that you're interested in. So if I move forward again, what I'm going to do is now look at this big picture, and it's probably looking very messy at the moment and very complicated because it is something that's abstract until you do it. So I'm hoping that I can guide you through that journey as we go. So I gave an example. Michael asked us, he said, okay, give a paper or that you can, that shows an example of how the methodology is applied. And so I've given the chapter that from Tina Overton's Festschrift that brought this bigger picture of design-based research together as an example. If I go back to the start of the whole process of this particular sequence of iterations, we had a grand plans and we really wanted to engage students in learning outcomes, and they're all listed there, which are very broad and come from different theoretical backgrounds and frameworks, but they looked like what we want students to be able to move forward in a curriculum with. And so these were important to us. Then we, as part of the process of saying, well, okay, how are we going to do this? We built a instructional design methodology. And this isn't just one theory or one perspective that's brought in. Well, teachers tend to draw on multiple things to bring them together to design something that will work for the students. And so we pulled on 4 areas. We looked at collaborative group work. We looked at real world scientific challenges. We looked at open problem solving. And we looked at the assessment through peer assessment and review. And I could spend the entire time talking about what we did, but I'm trying to stick to the idea of what is design-based research and how is it applied. So the Leepo evaluation framework in the context, well, okay, we want to have a task that enables students to have a learning experience where they can demonstrate to us all those different learning outcomes, but we're going to engage them in a learning environment which is group-based. We're going to support this through a technology so that we had students in Malaysia interacting with students in Australia. So again, it was very much a contextualized situation. We want them to spend time bringing things together and working as a group to solve a problem. So there was a learning environment, which was a technology platform. There was a learning process, a sequence of activities over time in this group task. And then there were the outcomes, which are measured in assessment submissions. So the Leepo framework enabled us to think, well, what's the evidence of first that they're engaging in that environment and they're active and they're interactive. So we could collect data from multiple sources towards the research questions that we had. What is the learning process? Well, how do we know they're sort of thinking about the different aspects that we wanted them to do? And again, I haven't got time to dig in too deeply to why we chose the different evaluation methods and instruments that we did, and but we drew on well-known literature resources for that. And then the outcomes, analysing their submissions. So the framework kind of gave us that global view of the different pieces that interacted in a single intervention in a single course to start with. Now, what does this look like in terms of the design-based research? Well, here it is. It's a longitudinal, iterative, cyclical, evaluative study. And there have been publications at different points along this process on different aspects. But what I'm presenting here is the overarching framework of design-based research. We started out way back in 2008. It seems such a long time ago, but it also seems like yesterday. When, like many of you, if you're teaching large classes, we had 1,100 students from 40 different programs. They really didn't, many of them didn't want to do chemistry. And one of the things I should point out about design-based research is it often involves a team of people. So I had an instructor who raised the issue here, well, these students just don't understand why they're studying chemistry. And then I was there as a chemistry education researcher in early days back then, but and then we had learning designers and other people around. So there was a team of people involved in this. It's not an individual. And that's how we can enable that research practice nexus. So the first iteration by the academic was, well, let's put them in groups, let's give them a chemistry topic, they can work together and they'll start to understand by talking to each other about how useful chemistry is. And of course it failed miserably and the course scores were low and students hated it, they hated being forced into groups, they hated being given a topic. And that was the point where we started the whole process of, well, what do we need to do? this isn't very well constructed. We analysed what happened, and we can see we need to improve the way that students engage in groups. And the second iteration wasn't much better. It went from bad to slightly bad. And we went to the literature first. We did the whole process of looking at collaborative group work, interdependency, assigning groups, being purposeful in those group assembly, in high, low achievers, mixing different groups of students together, or the same groups of students together. And still it didn't work. So this became the challenge, and that practice research interface was really starting to show, well, okay, we've got to be a little bit more deliberate, and that's the design function. So that's the point where we were fortunate in getting funding, and we were able to bring together a whole project team, and they came from across several schools. We had an engineer, we had a mathematician, we had chemists, we had learning designers. So it was a big team of people. And that was where we really went deeply into what do we need to do to get students to engage authentically in this task and learn. What are the learning outcomes? And so that design construction process took us to a place of letting students choose, letting them choose the group, letting them choose a scenario that they connected to, giving them open inquiry problems, introducing interdependency, and doing peer assessment. And the course scores went up, student learning was evidenced, and you can go to the chapter to see the different forms of evidence we got for that. And so that design process had taken us through 3 years. So, still pursuing the same sort of questions about research. Well, of course, at that point, you might say, well, okay, let's just let it go and it'll iterate and move on to the next thing, or what's the next research question? Unfortunately, when things work, you often start to tweak. And so we started asking questions such as, well, okay, how do we improve that? What makes students more connected to chemistry? And after a few iterations, we tightened up a whole bunch of things. Again, you might say, well, stop there, publish your papers, move on. But then it became, well, this is really interesting about how students explain to each other and communicate, and what's the discourse that's going on, because the chemistry identity wasn't strong at the start. Can we improve that? And so we transformed the whole task from a written report into a video. And then we started giving them quantitative problems, and so forth. And so we then saw multiple more iterations and research and evaluation questions, and the process kept going. So what I'm trying to convey here is that design-based research enables the process of building on prior research in the group, drawing on other theories, and then sort of, when interesting data comes out of it, going back to the publishing and sharing the outcomes to sort of build evidence against those theories that you've built. Anyway, I'm going to jump to how that same set of research is still in action, because you might think, well, did you ever let go? Well, actually, no, because you keep asking new questions. And we moved a few years ago to blended learning environments. And so one of the ways that you can engage students in online and blended learning is to have them feel part of the community and to engage in conversations with each other. And this seemed an ideal basis to introduce a task where we actually got them to explain real world situations using the elements that we'd built into the instructional framework. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes doing that, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. So I'm going to come back to that idea of what the newest version of this thread that's going through in terms of the research is. But first of all, I've been talking, so I'm going to ask you a question, because one of the things that came up to us during these tasks was well, students we want interdependency. They're bringing something to this, but they have different thinking. So what I want to do is just to break up my process, and I'm hoping Michael's got a poll thing happening here, is very quickly, I want you to, what comes into your head, write or draw an image that represents what infinity means to you. I use this all the time because it's a nice general topic, but it has interesting outcomes. So draw something, write something. What does infinity mean to you? I'll just give you a minute. So you don't need to draw on my screen. I'm going to put up some possibilities, and you can select one of the 4 options that I give you. Michael, do you have that poll tool? Lovely. Okay.
So I guess people want to answer question 1. I just had a practice question in there to see how it works, but people answer question 1.
Okay, so question 1. Okay, so I'm going to bring up 4 options for you, and I can see some lovely pictures already coming up. So here we are. Here are 4 options that you might have gone to. You might have thought of the time, infinity of the time. I've got the arrow there that looks like the time arrow. You might have thought of space, the universe, boundless. You might have gone to the numerical form, or option 4, you might have gone, and some people do, to Buzz Lightyear. Yay, infinity and beyond. And it's actually interesting when you ask primary school children about this, and they will always start doubling and multiplying infinity. So if you'd like to answer the poll question and select A, B, C, or D. Is it easy to do that, Michael? What do people click?
I see answers coming in, so I'm not quite sure how they're doing it, but people are doing it.
I think you must click on the box in your screen. It should be sitting, I think it looks like it's, you can highlight and click on the question 1 answer.
So we have about 12% of votes coming in. Let me just... I'm making you
they're coming in for both.
Yeah.
That's okay. So that's interesting, because different questions have got different biases there. So jumping up now, people are answering. We've got about 77.
Hey, Gwen and Michael, it's Alison Flynn speaking. Someone in the chat just said that you have to answer all 3 of the questions in order to be able to submit the answers.
Oh, I see.
Oh, right. Okay.
Oh,
well,
sorry,
we'll
that's
have
my mistake. I will. Do you want me to? I can. What I'll do is I'll create a proper one for this next time. Yeah.
That's okay. There's another question a bit later. So I think what we'll do then is we've got like 90. So unless you want to really quickly answer, we might turn it into the score. It's obviously going to take people a little longer if they've got to do 3 answers.
So you need me to just tot it up, is it?
Yeah, that's right. Do you end poll? I think it will turn into a graph.
All right. Yeah. Share results. So I guess.
Yep. So A, C, and almost C. So that's the endless time and the number, it seems to be, and that's very common. People kind of like think of it as infinity is forever type sort of thing, rather than the actual spatial infinity. And the number and symbol, our mathematicians love that one. So, but what that does is that if you look at those poll results, and I hope people can see them, is actually, that's very normal for that to be pretty spread across all of them. And that's because people have different views, and our students have different views. So one of the things that challenged us in what we thought we could actually embrace and use is that idea of, well, let them bring their explanations in this group work and then debate those. So what we've done in the most recent iteration of this research is to actually, and I'm just looking how I can get rid of the, that's it, is we've built the task, so it's still interdependency. We asked students to watch a video of a real world phenomena on their own. And this is all online, so it's worked very well, except for when we had issues of bandwidth in the internet this semester. But generally, this was a task that was built for COVID, because it just slotted into the idea of students working together and discussing concepts in chemistry. We have 2 tasks, one in thermo and one in solutions. The students explain what they see. They then bring all the explanations, they queue like a bus, and they get put into a group of 4. They look at each other's explanations, and then as a group, they discuss and develop a consensus position. And then they moved into reflection, and that's really important. They think about whether their thinking changed as a basis of their discussion. So the whole idea of what we were doing very early on and just getting them to write assignments and make videos, now we're getting more deeper into critical thinking. And we've drawn on experts in the field and their rubrics to help us assess this. And we give the students instructions to think about their analysing, making arguments, the accuracy argument, and most importantly, reflection. What are they thinking? What are their group mates are thinking, and does it make a difference? It's really interesting actually how many students do shift. An example of the outcomes of that task is here in terms of the conversations. Different students are coloured in different backgrounds here, and these are consenting students. We have ethics for everything we do. This is a group where we had 3 students, 2 very high achieving students, so our grades go from 1 to 5, 7 being the highest, and the reflection of the student who had a grade of 5 there. So that evolution from very simple ideas in instructional design into something very complicated has happened over a very long time. Each time an iteration and drawing on one theory and drawing what's out there published as ways of actually enabling what we hope to achieve. So as I say, any of these things that I'm sharing, I'm happy to discuss with people afterwards. And you can see there's a simple rubric in the online interface for the tutors to use to mark using the rubric. So where do you start with design-based research? I mean, obviously I've shown a huge big picture program of multiple semesters and what you might be teaching in a high school classroom or other contexts. You might be online only, you might have been fully face-to-face and suddenly had to flip. So actually what I'm going to say to you is actually maybe this is a perfect time to think about where you might start and enter those cycles, because we actually have a natural comparison in some ways of pre and post, what you were doing before and what you're doing now. What I want to go back to is that there's a lot of research around student learning online, and it started with more, and there's a whole bunch of stuff which is really useful, but the core, the core basis of students learning successfully online, it comes down to 3 interactions: the student-teacher interaction, the student-student interaction, and the student-content interaction. And so you can use those as places to start if you are looking at any question that you might have in terms of starting research or developing your theory and turning it into something that goes into practice. So what I want you to do with your piece of paper, and I realise that I'm pushing time here, so I'm keeping an eye on it, is I want you to quickly scribble down some thoughts. And as I said, this would either go pear-shaped or it would go well. This is the first time I've run a workshop in this sort of Zoom-posium style. What I'd like you to do, start thinking about, well, can I engage with a design-based research cycle, is think about your context and what you're already doing, and whether there's opportunity to actually move that into that the process where we do the analysis first, and then we do an intervention which is informed by research or theory, and then we move on to analyze what the impact of that was. So just, can I get you to draw on your piece of paper 4 squares and answer the question? I've got 4 questions here, or statements, complete statements. So my research tells me that our students will learn better if we. So how would you finish that based on what you do in your own classroom? It might not be your research, it might be just research tells me that our students will learn better if we. And of course, as I said, we're in messy times at the moment, but you might have been doing something before we entered the current environment that we're in. So before you start thinking about changing anything, what did you measure already? What's your baseline? And the design-based research cycle always starts with a baseline, knowing what the students, who your students are, knowing what they're thinking, so that they're usually diverse, and how have you managed to capture that, or what sort of assessment have you been doing that's raised the question that you might have? So how have you been measuring that? So we can use COVID as the example. What changed when we changed to a new environment, an online environment? It used to be that we had the luxury of saying, well, what changed when we introduced a new textbook, or we introduced going to the flipped cycle, or so many other questions on the current one, but maybe you still have opportunity to follow those up. And the last question is, well, what data do I have to collect to answer that? Because the whole point of design-based research is that the cycles rely on the evaluation at the end of each process as such. So that informs the research, it informs the next cycle, and so on. So now that's probably been a bit quick, and I apologize if it is, but these will go up later. So I'm hoping it might prompt you to think, well, in my classroom, in my institution, in my field, if I'm teaching or I'm researching, is there something that might iterate through collaborating with others, or partnering with other teachers, that we can start to think about how we can build that into a thread. So, as I said, we've been working with blended learning for a few years now, and last year we went into much more deeply into online learning. So we're fortunate that we have a whole suite of data from a year ago that we will repeat evaluation of this year, and we can sort of look at partially online to fully online. But just some examples of the ways that we're sort of evaluating the different interactions. So if we look at our current situation, the student content interaction, well, it's all now through online and interactions with the teachers. So we can look at different pieces of the puzzle in terms of, are they working in discussion forums like Piazza? How am I communicating with students? I use something called Learning Pathway in Blackboard, which is click points to course content, and I've got click data. The face-to-face lectures no longer exist. We have Zoom consults, we have lecture recordings, but we still have peer support. So I have students engaging differently in that peer support. They weren't doing it very well last year. Are they doing it better this year? So there's all sorts of things that you can focus any one point of and sort of say, well, look, you know, if that's the situation, can I change it? And as I keep alluding to, there's a lot of research in online learning, and I'm using that as a context for now that's very current. We can draw on what's known already to inform anything that we might change, and then measure how it's worked. So some of the instructional design that we've used for learning environments has led us to some of the more specific research studies that we have. We look at scaffolding. What do we need to do? Does the teacher guide students? Can we use prompts? Can we get them to work in self-directed ways? We use formative feedback. So that's other questions relate to, you know, how are students engaging with feedback? How do we deliver that? What are the questions we ask? We often use concept imageries, and Stacey's going to talk about that a bit later on. So our research has drawn a lot from several groups that have developed concept imageries already. We're trying to foster communities of inquiry, such as the task that I showed you before, the chat task that we have, which is online. We have how do students engage with representations that we put when the teacher's not there to guide and model? Multimedia learning, we know from research, I've had PhD students look, and Mamoon's work is bolded there, that students rely very heavily on prompts and narration and guidance. They can't just navigate things like simulations, and I know quite a lot of research is out there already about using those resources, and then how do we then get our students to engage with them as a contextual dependence. Cognitive load, discipline, discourse, so you can go on. So there's a whole bunch of things and ways into design-based research that you can take. You can pick one that's most relevant to your students and your context. And I might be doing sweeping statements, and I hope I'm not, but I'm trying to sort of give little prompts and ideas for places to start maybe. So we've used the Leepo Framework again for the past few years, and our data comes from all sorts of things. So we use click data because we're working in online environments. How are students navigating the learning management system, the quizzes, what are they going to? We've used focus group interviews with students. We've used individual interviews with students. We use surveys. We use scales, and we've included the community of inquiry scale and the MILI in our scales. And now we've got that data from last year. We've moved our labs to virtual labs this year. It'll be interesting to see the comparison in the MILI between last year and this year when we collect that data. And there's the one thing that we're really interested in is representations. And we've the last couple of years, we're really focusing on what do we put in an online environment to help students build connections between representations and understand the features that are implicit, that are sometimes explained very well by a teacher in a classroom and not necessarily as explicit in an online environment. I just want to give you an example of data that we've collected. So we're also interested in digital literacy. And so this is other data that you can look at. If you use a quantitative scale to categorize students as high or low digital literacy, and there's a lot of statistical stuff behind that, so it's very sweeping, we can actually see across a semester how they engage. And what we see is that low digital literacy students often click more around times of assessment than high digital literacy students. And so we're doing interviews currently to work out, you know, how are students learning in online environments. And we assume that you put it all out there like that baseball pitch and they'll go play the game. But actually there's so many more variables in play than we can imagine. And we need to tease those out and see what becomes a barrier or not. And you can see some of the tasks like the chat tasks that I described before on those activities there. So that's just different types of data that you collect in the classroom or the learning environments that to give us an idea of what students are doing, and then we can connect to that to other activities. So my second question, and sorry Michael, I'll try and finish up really quickly, but I'd be curious to know what people think about this. So there's a paper which asks the question early on when design-based research first came out. It asked, if design-based research is the answer, what is the question? So I'd just like, if we have very quickly time to look at it, what question, it's a bit more, what's the game called, Jeopardy or something? You know, what is the question? So if DBR is the answer, what is the question? So just do a poll there. What do you think the question might be that you would ask? Wow, we're powering through this one, Michael.
Yes, finally figured it out. We'll wrap up when you can.
Yeah, and I will skip through to the last slide and just do a sum up after this. That's interesting. I had no idea what to expect with this. These are questions that are raised by Deed. Well, they're my interpretations of the questions, of course.
So do you want me to share the results?
Okay, yeah. So 60% went with D, which does surprise me because I thought it might be C. So because when this type of framework came out, the question is, well, is it really real? But I like the question, how do we do transformative research? Because that really reflects the idea we're working out that nexus between research informing practice and practice informing research. But it is messy, and we acknowledge that, so we have to be careful. Okay, so I'll just skip through to my last point. I think there were only a couple of other example slides, but we don't need those. So close that down. How do we do that? Okay. And I've got that whirlwind because there can be a sense of the whirlwind around all this hurricane. So I'm going to skip through these. And it was just another example of practice and how things led from one thing to another. I just want to finish up with some words of reflection of having been involved with this for a few years. Design-based research is still regarded as a new paradigm, but you can see from the number of publications that this is really gaining traction as a way to recognize the research that's done and informs practice, and how what student outcomes are then feeds back into the loop to build research and raise new questions. However, its iterative basis means that when you're doing lots of iterations, that you have to work quickly. You don't have a lot of time to sort of reflect on the results from one semester before you might need to implement something for the next semester. And you do need to give yourself time to stand back and look at those pictures and spend time to, even if it's just one semester's worth of data, actually try and analyze that. And I say that and I'm really bad at it, but those big picture things that need to be published and inform the field need to come out, and design-based research can sometimes stop that. It doesn't allow for traditional experimental approaches. Most people involved in this research want to do an intervention because they believe it's beneficial for students. So being able to compare a control group with the experimental group isn't something that you might likely try in this type of research. And there are many journals out there that really want to see that sort of experimental approach. You still need to link your, when you publish this work, it has to still be linked to prior research, theoretical frameworks, use established methodologies, and then be able to link your outcomes back to that to be able to publish it. So it still fits in the paradigm of what we do in chemistry education research. And I just want to finish by acknowledging a whole bunch of people, and there's more that have been involved over the years, and these are just a snapshot. So thank you, and sorry if I've gone over time. I tried to keep time.
Thank you very much, Gwen. That's, as always, an amazing survey. You've crammed so much in, it's amazing. And I think what we really wanted to convey here was the power of design-based research in the very messy world and the extraordinarily messy situation you deal with such large numbers of students. So thank you very much. I'm guessing there will be time in coffee break if people are able to catch up a chat, but I am aware that you are at the other end of the time zone, we may not be able to lean on you too much to stay for the end, but thank you very much for joining us.
No, I'm going to hang around, so I'll try and look at the chat and to reply if anything's in the chat. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'll figure out to stop